Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today we have two guests. One is Matt Fogarty, who is the head of business and human rights at General Motors Corporation. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
And the other is Caroline Watson, a longtime frequent guest of the show. Good to have you back, Caroline.
Hi, Tim.
So today we're going to talk about, we talk about how we have a podcast for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. Today is going to be one of the trade nerd podcasts, but I think it's one that it really does apply to normal human beings, but this might be one that sneaks up on folks. We're going to talk about the information and communication technology and services regulations and executive orders and kind of how that whole program got started. And I know that, in your position in trade and human rights, Matt, that is of great interest to you because there is now kind of a subspecies of ICTS that involves connected vehicles. And so why don't we start by let me throw out a discussion about Executive Order 13873 from 2019, a President Trump executive order. I mean, this is an area of bipartisan concern, and so I think we should start with the Trump 1 executive order and go from there.
Yeah, so this was the executive order that President Trump issued in, I think, the first attempt to block WeChat and TikTok in the United States. And those two particular prohibitions ended up being challenged in court, ended up being paused and ultimately, I think, abandoned. But the executive order still stands. And it's, I think one thing that's particularly notable about it is that it is incredibly broad, right? So it gives the Commerce Secretary incredibly broad authority to regulate transactions in the information and communications technology and services, ICTS, supply chain space. Transactions is open-ended. Foreign adversary is open-ended. Really just a very, very broad executive order.
And Caroline, what's the concern here? Why is the U.S. so concerned? Why was President Trump in his first term so concerned about ICTS technology, and particularly ICTS technology coming into the United States from certain countries?
Yeah, there's a couple areas of concern for subversion and sabotage using access to these systems that are such a part of our daily lives that essentially there's a huge vulnerability on a personal level and on a governmental or country level. So there's, our individual personal data that could be exposed through backdoor access in this kind of technology. Or you can think at a higher level for society. We have infrastructure that is very sensitive that could be sabotaged using backdoor access to these systems. Infrastructure, you think all kinds of data breaches that we're experiencing now could be vulnerable in this type of way. I was just curious to get your perspective more from a tech background, from the vehicle industry, how their assessment of this vulnerability looks from the industry perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I think one, always dangerous to let the lawyers talk about technology. My creative writing graduate degree and my JD don't do much for me in terms of technology, but certainly, in the vehicle space, and then we can get to this, but the most recent and really kind of the first significant use of this ICTS authority that President Trump started back in 2019 relating to connected vehicles, I think the Commerce Department, which has sort of been in the process of building out the infrastructure to implement the executive order, I think really did a great job of laying out some of the different vulnerabilities that you might find in ICTS systems, and of course in these regulations it was specific to vehicles, but I think probably translate across industries. I think the two that they really identified were the possibility of or the potential for a bad actor to exfiltrate sensitive data off of a vehicle, and then second, the possibility or the potential for a bad actor to remotely access or manipulate a vehicle. And so if you sort of extrapolate that to other sort of ICTS systems, you think about your internet connection, your internet connectivity, think about cell phones, think about a variety of other technologies that would face those same sorts of vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's all. So that's just at a high level. I'm kind of thinking of there's spying. That's one concern, and then the other concern is kind of like a sci-fi movie where it's like somebody's going to sit in Beijing and start controlling all of the cars or all of the refrigerators or all of the whatever in the U.S. and that obviously is kind of a nightmare scenario. I guess one question I have is how realistic that is, but I assume that these orders are based on things that we probably don't get to see and may never get to see.
I think. I'm sorry. Go ahead,
I was just going to say on that point, Tim, I think that the fact that we're seeing the bipartisan support throughout administrations as well as throughout different branches of government, Congress has been talking about this issue as well as the executive branch, underlies your point, is that there's probably a lot of information there that we don't have access to that they do, that's generating all of this.
And I think particularly in the connected vehicle space, I think, interesting to note that the Chinese government kind of beat the U.S. government to these same sorts of restrictions. So vehicles sold in China are subject to a number of restrictions that aren't exactly, not exactly the same as what was put forward in the ICTS connected vehicles rule, but really similar, right? So restrictions on how you use camera data or data that vehicles are gathering as they're driving through a city, restrictions on mapping and particularly high definition mapping where you're using sensors to create an image of the surrounding areas on a vehicle, restrictions around what non-Chinese vehicles can access Chinese military bases or Chinese government locations, right? So I think, in a lot of ways, I think you could say the U.S. government's just playing catch up here, or, even just being, reciprocal to a lot of the restrictions the Chinese government has had in place for quite some time now.
No, that's really a great point, and it's actually, kind of an emerging trend, I think, in trade law generally, is that the U.S. has a bunch of restrictions that the U.S. builds in, and we have very good reasons for them. But at the same time, China comes back with other restrictions that are sometimes viewed as countermeasures. But from a national security perspective, any country is going to have concerns about its own national security and make regulations to protect it. And it does sound like China on this one was out front. On some of the other restrictions, kind of the counter entity rule restrictions that we're seeing out of China and some of the other things, they seem to be more reactive, but this one may have been a U.S. reaction to China. Well, we've talked already a little bit about the bipartisan nature of these reforms. So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the President Trump's original executive order was kind of translated into an entire department at the Commerce Department under President Biden?
Oh man, great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been years in the making, right? So there was that initial attempt to block TikTok and WeChat, which, as I said, kind of went through the courts, and a little bit in parallel, Commerce Department kind of took this new authority and with the support of Congress, with sort of bipartisan support, started over the last several years to build out the infrastructure within Commerce to really implement this order, right? I think really seeing one, kind of the national security concern, and two, the broad and flexible authority that I think ICTS gives Commerce to take action in this space, right? And so, over the last several years, I don't know what the exact number of personnel is now, but they established the Office of ICTS, the OICTS, led by someone named Liz Cannon, who came over from Microsoft. Incredibly capable, good solid team over there. Number of people working in the office now, and I think their appropriations are kind of ramping up. They started last year with kind of the first real kind of successful use of the ICTS order in blocking Kaspersky Labs, the Russian connected antivirus software company. and kind of simultaneously issued the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking on connected vehicles. And so you see them really sort of ramping up, and they've indicated in a variety of forums that they really do intend to use this authority and be active in it. And they've identified a number of areas where they might be going next, right? They've certainly talked about commercial vehicles, but then, I mean, if you just go to their website at bis.gov, they lay out sort of what they see as the priority technologies for regulation of the ICTS.
That's great. And Caroline, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of the regs themselves, the ICTS regulations, and then after we get to that, we can move on to the connected vehicles.
Yeah, so the ICTS regs, they came out a lot earlier. They were first issued in the first Trump administration. Biden had them amended twice, most recently at the end of 2024, effective February of this year. They have a basically concept for Commerce to be able to review transactions that are termed ICTS transactions and impose restrictions or prohibit some of those transactions if they determine that there's an unacceptable or undue risk to ICTS supply chains, critical infrastructure in the U.S., national security, or just U.S. persons' security and safety generally. And so this kind of mirrors the idea of CFIUS review for a lot of transactions. People may be more familiar with how CFIUS conducts reviews of transactions.
And for our non-trade nerds, that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the multi-agency committee that reviews direct investment by foreign companies or individuals in the U.S. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. There are some key differences, though. CFIUS has some mandatory filings and voluntary filings, whereas that doesn't quite exist yet under these ICTS review regulations. Commerce can initiate a review on its own. It can accept a referral for review, but none of those are mandatory. And in the end, Commerce can apply similar kind of prohibitions or restrictions based on security concerns, as CFIUS would. But it's just kind of a different process, and I think Kaspersky showed how this would work a little differently than CFIUS does. So that action was initiated pursuant to actually a referral from the DOJ back in 2021, and it took several years to play out. And it is very interesting to read through that final determination, which came out mid-2024, how they've laid out the process, and I think setting a blueprint for what they could do in the future. But back to the regs, these regs only cover a certain set of countries. It's China and Russia, as well as Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and then the, quote, Maduro regime of Venezuela is how it's termed. And so the link there doesn't have to be directly to the country, as we see in the Kaspersky action. That can be an indirect link targeting a U.S. company that is ultimately determined to be owned or controlled by one of these countries or subject to their jurisdiction. And then there's also the technology aspect of what's covered technology-wise. And that has been recently expanded to encompass a list of new critical and emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, advanced computing, data privacy, autonomous systems, robotics, semiconductors, everything that's hot right now gets lumped in.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one distinction I might draw between the CFIUS regs and the ICTS regulations, right? So CFIUS's focus is really well defined to any sort of transfer of ownership or control of a U.S. business to a foreign person, and it's in some ways broad in that it could be any foreign person, but also sort of very narrowly focused on a specific set of transactions. Whereas the Commerce Authority, which I think hasn't really been resolved in the regulations, but certainly consistent with the broad authority in the executive order. I mean, the idea of what transactions Commerce might regulate is really open-ended, right? It could be just about any kind of transaction, and you could see. I think one concern on the part of industry when those regs were first put out was are we intending to get it like basic retail transactions, right? You could think of a variety, like a whole universe of transactions that, fortunately for all of us, CFIUS doesn't come anywhere close to, but really gives the Commerce Secretary incredible authority and also great flexibility to get it just about any kind of transaction.
Yeah, I think that's really important is that, when you're comparing to CFIUS, what the comparator is that you have kind of governmental review of certain transactions, but the scope of the ICTS regs, although it's in some ways limited to certain types of technology and services, the scope of what you're doing with those technology and services is really broad. And I think, as Caroline pointed out, it's also not even clear kind of who it applies to. So we know that it applies to certain countries, but what is the connection to those countries that triggers ICTS review is actually, subsidiaries, importers, ownership in the U.S. Like, it's pretty broad in terms of, at least as I see it, how connected to those countries you have to be.
Yeah, and the executive order and the ICTS regulations use the owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of one of those foreign adversary countries language, which we're seeing pop up in a bunch of different contexts now, right? So that was in the CHIPS Act, which related to funding for semiconductor projects. It was included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, included in the Inflation Reduction Act, tied to foreign entities of concern for consumer tax credits for sales of electric vehicles. So I think you're absolutely right. That language is so open ended, so very broad. It's not clear, exactly, you have somebody inside one of those countries, sure, that makes a lot of sense. But then, I think looking at it from an industry perspective, the thing that really triggers a significant due diligence requirement on us is this idea that you could have somebody, outside, far away from one of those countries, who still has, enough of a nexus with those countries to be captured by this rule.
Right. I mean, it's the supply chain issues that I think are probably going to be the toughest in terms of compliance with this, because essentially you're looking for connections to those countries and imports, usually, but essentially that connection can be 6 steps down the chain, and you may not even know it unless you do a lot of supply chain due diligence.
And I think it gets a little more complicated even when you get to the software aspect, because when it applies to software that's sourced from countries or companies that might have links to certain countries, that can be even more difficult in the supply chain to trace back, or to document that and determine kind of what the relationship is there. And I think
That's a great point.
that plays out in Kaspersky as well, and shows kind of the ripple effect that these restrictions have, because when you look at the prohibitions that came out, it wasn't just Kaspersky products themselves. It extended to products and services that incorporate or use Kaspersky services and products. So white label products or anything, that incorporated those got swept into the restrictions.
Yeah, another due diligence challenge, I guess I would say, in terms of, if you're buying from Kaspersky, that's one thing. If you're buying from somebody who bought from Kaspersky and doesn't put the Kaspersky name on it.
Yeah. It's
Well,
a boon for due diligence companies.
yes, I'm guessing.
I'm sure we've all met them at the various conferences and whatnot. It's a
Yes.
great industry to be in. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these new trade laws that have come out in the last 5 years or so have been a huge boon for due diligence companies. They've certainly had a good number of projects that have been generated by a lot of these new trade laws, and I'm thinking, here, not just of ICTS, but also a lot of the laws that relate to supply chain in China and Xinjiang are also due diligence bonanzas. So with that, why don't we kind of talk about what I view as a subspecies of ICTS, but one that has a little more substance, has been a little more fleshed out, and that's the connected vehicle regulations. Matt, I know you've been heavily involved in those, so why don't you kick off and tell us a little more about the ICTS connected vehicle regulations?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe start with a little bit of a timeline. So kind of kicked off within the Biden administration last year in February or March of last year with an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking in which Commerce, sent out the feelers essentially, right, and laid out what they saw as at the time as kind of the major concerns related to major national security issues related to connected vehicles and vehicle connectivity, as well as autonomous vehicles, and that proceeded to a round of public comments there, and proceeded to a proposed rule that we got last fall, which laid out really in extensive detail, one, what Commerce sees as the national security threat posed by connected vehicles that have, some potential connection to China or Russia, which is where they sort of narrowed in on China and Russia from that list of countries that Caroline discussed earlier. And then kind of walked through proposed prohibitions on transactions involving connected vehicles. That all got a bit more refined, and then just before the change of administrations in mid-January, we got a final rule that set a 90-day effective date, and so this became effective in March of this year. Really, kind of an extensive rule. I think the prohibitions in the rule, there is a timeline for when those prohibitions come into effect, and we can talk about that timeline. But I think really kind of notable to think that, from the Trump administration, so this is something that was drafted by the Biden administration. The Trump administration came into office, and if you recall, President Trump's day one executive orders and memos, there was the America First trade policy document that called for a review of a number of Biden administration actions with the potential, with an eye toward limiting them, abandoning them. I think notable that specifically in regard to the connected vehicles rule, the Trump administration called on a review to see if there's ways to expand it, right? So this is something that, you talked about the bipartisan support for ICTS generally. I think, there's clearly bipartisan support for this connected vehicles rule in particular. And, I think about it in kind of two big buckets, and we can get into more detail on this, but, the rule lays out, on one hand, there's a universe of stuff we cannot do. I think there are four essentially basic prohibitions. And then on the other hand, there's a whole list of the stuff we have to do to demonstrate that we're complying with the rule. And that is where I think we'll see ongoing compliance obligations on the part of industry, particularly automakers. But I think this is something that applies to a number of industries that touch the automotive at all. It's going to apply to our suppliers. It's going to apply, really down, up and down kind of the supply chain. So, yeah.
Well, and let me walk through a couple of questions that I have. So first, in terms of connected vehicles, with ICTS technology, do we have any idea kind of what percentage of vehicles that are made today would fall within the definition of connected vehicles? I'm guessing it's close to 100, but I don't know the answer to that. I'm guessing you
right.
do.
Yeah. I mean, the way that they've yes, yeah, I would say it's probably close to 100%, and at least in the U.S., right? Right. Some other economies that you may not see as connected, but particularly how where they've sort of drawn the lines, where they've set the thresholds. I think, just about every vehicle driving around the U.S. on public roads would be considered to be a connected vehicle for these purposes.
Got it. So basically, any vehicle that is made now in the U.S. is going to have certain, but basically prohibitions that could apply to it, plus a lot of due diligence and certification requirements at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And our initial analysis, just speaking for a second on behalf of GM, right? Like our initial analysis is that I think all of our vehicle models will require, will fall within the scope of the rule.
Interesting. And so why don't we walk through the four prohibitions? If we can just kind of talk through each one as we get to them.
Yeah. So, the way the rule sets it out distinguishes between hardware and software, distinguishes between what they call vehicle connectivity systems and automated driving systems. But really, so there's four prohibitions. One, can't import into the United States any vehicle connectivity system hardware that's designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by a covered person. And that's somebody with the nexus to China or Russia, which we kind of talked about, and we can touch on how they define that. Second prohibition, no importing into the United States or selling in the United States any completed connected vehicles that incorporate vehicle connectivity system hardware or automated driving system software designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by covered persons, right? So, think about a company like GM or U.S. company. Those are kind of the two big prohibitions that apply to us, right? Can't import VCS hardware, can't that's has a China or a Russian nexus. Can't import or sell vehicles that have that incorporate connectivity systems or automated driving system software that is supplied by covered persons. Then maybe sort of a second set of the other two prohibitions apply really to OEMs, manufacturers who are themselves covered persons, right? So a covered person is prohibited from selling in the United States a completed connected vehicle that incorporates connectivity system hardware or connectivity system or automated driving system software. So VCS hardware, software, or ADS software, regardless of where that software or hardware comes from, right? So if you have like a BYD, for example, this rule would prohibit BYD from selling vehicles in the United States, even if they build them here, they design them here, they develop them here, entirely U.S. supply chain. BYD, given their China-ness, their China nexus, would be prohibited from selling vehicles here. And then the fourth one is that covered persons, so again, sort of your China-connected OEMs or manufacturers, they're prohibited from offering commercial services in the United States that utilize connected vehicles that incorporate automated driving systems. So, you think of like a robo-taxi service, right? This fourth prohibition would prohibit somebody like a BYD from offering a robo-taxi service in the United States if it incorporates software meeting this definition. Regardless of where that software comes from, again, so it's those last two prohibitions really focused on the person who's doing the activity.
Right. So two that apply essentially to, for lack of a better term, U.S. companies, and then two that are basically companies that are owned or controlled by countries of concern or companies in countries of concern that might set up shop in the U.S. but still are not going to be able to do any of the activities that are restricted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and on the first side of things, I would say U.S. companies, but anybody really doing business in the United States, right? So right. Your VWs and your BMWs are also going to, and your Hyundais and others are going to have to grapple with this rule as well.
Yep. So with that though, those prohibitions don't go into effect right away.
Correct.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the phasing in terms of the timeline.
Sure. So the software prohibitions will begin with model year 2027, which, for those who aren't steeped in the vehicle and the automotive industry, model year 2027 begins sometime in 2026, probably late 2026. And then the hardware prohibitions will begin with model year 2030. So again, sometime in 2029, which I think is why it's important for us to be talking about this now, because I think this may come into effect a little bit. We might see some effects a little bit sooner than maybe people are thinking. One piece of the proposed rule that got a number of comments and that Commerce addressed in the final rule is this idea of legacy software or legacy hardware. As an automotive manufacturer, we have some obligations to have sort of warranty parts, and service parts available for our older vehicles, right? And that would carry on well past model year 2030, for example.
Right.
And so the rule does provide some carve-outs for VCS hardware that is intended for pre-model year 2030 models. So you can keep importing those. And then on the software side of things, a lot of folks raise questions about, hey, we have software that we've written and it's in the vehicle and it's going to keep being in the vehicle. What about that kind of software that's sort of legacy software that's been around? Do we have to go back and rewrite it? And Commerce, I think, very, very wisely, very savvy the way they wrote this. They set sort of a cutoff date. So March 16th, 2026, any code developed in existence before that date is essentially exempted from the rule. Anything created after that date would still be covered by the rule. And so, that I think provides great certainty to us and to others to know, exactly, March 15th, 2026, if you have stuff that's developed in China, that's the time to sort of fork it off and bring development into the United States for whatever you might be writing for the model year 2027.
So I'm guessing that's keeping you pretty busy right now. I mean, not only kind of trying to figure out how you're going to how you're going to kind of hit that deadline, but also figuring out kind of where is everything coming from. That is, what parts do we have that we would need to wean off of by that date?
Yeah, I think that's right. The way vehicle development cycles go, I mean, we're sourcing now for vehicles that'll be, within these model years. And so, yeah, it's an active issue for us, something that we're constantly looking at. I think fortunately we have good insight into a lot of the relevant systems. I think one thing that's really helpful is the way Commerce wrote the rule really does sort of narrow into, it's like a narrow subset of stuff on the vehicle, right? I think the earlier discussion around the rule and the proposed rule left it maybe a little bit broader. There was some concern about things like key fobs or digital keys, right, that have sort of wireless communication. Is that something that Commerce is going after? And they expressly carved that out. Things like sensors, which LiDAR has been in the news a lot in the last couple of years. A number of members of Congress have expressed concern about LiDAR, and Commerce considered things like sensors and bringing them into the rule, but I think pretty wisely left them out and really did focus in like, okay, what's the pinch point when there's data that's coming off a vehicle or coming onto a vehicle, right? And focused in on the connectivity systems and then also the automated driving systems.
That's really helpful. So Caroline, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the due diligence requirements that are now going to go into place? I'm sure those are things that Matt's dealing with as well, so you guys should both chime in, but we'll start with you, Caroline.
Right. Well, I think the key thing here, as Matt was saying, is that there's going to be due diligence requirements even if your sourcing isn't prohibited. If there's any kind of foreign interest relating to these two systems, the VCS or the ADS systems, then you're going to have to generally file this annual declaration of conformity that says our vehicles are compliant with these restrictions, and you have to conduct the due diligence and documentation behind that to support your declaration. So it's rigorous exercise from my understanding, and Matt can certainly speak to that more, I'm sure. But from my perspective, I can't see with global supply chains there being vehicles that are generally not affected by that. Maybe there's some supply chains that don't have foreign sourcing in ADS or VCS components or software, and therefore they don't have to worry about this. But Matt, I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think one thing is, General Motors, we're a pretty big company. I've got a small team, but we have some capability to deal with sort of the compliance obligations here. I think it's probably a bit more of a burden on our suppliers, right, which tend to be much leaner organizations. And then if you start talking about overseas suppliers who may not have the familiarity with or the awareness of U.S. law, then I think that could well be a bit of a surprise to them. And so, a lot right now is a bit of an education effort in making sure that our suppliers understand their obligations, they understand what our expectations are going to be for them, to help feed into these declarations of conformity, as you said. So part of the rule requires anyone who's importing VCS hardware into the U.S. or who's selling completed and connected vehicles to submit on an annual basis a declaration of conformity providing a number of different data points. The name of the importer or who the manufacturer is, the connected vehicle manufacturer, the FCC ID number of the hardware and the subcomponents, the vehicles that are covered. We've got to do that on an annual basis, or anytime there's a material change, we have to update it. There had been a provision in the proposed rule that would have required us to submit to Commerce software bills of materials and hardware bills of materials, basically detailing, down to the chip level, like, hey, here's every single hardware, vehicle connectivity system hardware component in the vehicle that we're selling, that we import. Even if certainly cannot be from one of the prohibited countries, but even if we're just drawing something from anywhere overseas, right? And then something similar on the software side, detailing all the different pieces of code and where they originated, that are relevant to the rule. I think fortunately, that raises a number of kind of confidentiality concerns for our suppliers, right? They don't. I think that's really sensitive information for us, and particularly for our suppliers. I think fortunately for all of us in the final rule, Commerce determined to not require us to submit the SBOMs and the HBOMs, but we are still required to maintain those, to keep them for 10 years at that. I think there will be, in addition to sort of this declaration of conformity, we're going to have to submit on an annual basis to Commerce. There is, a fairly extensive kind of behind the scenes set of documentation we're going to have to keep on hand for quite some time.
And on that point, I think one thing that's noteworthy is that there's no exceptions for that requirement for allied jurisdictions, right? So
yeah, exactly.
A broad base that has to comply with that.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I would think that the due diligence would become even harder because of that, just because essentially, you're dealing with a company that's, say, in Norway, but you're still going to have to figure out both their supply chain and their ownership structure and make sure that it doesn't have the requisite amount of kind of connection to a country of concern, even if what you think you're getting is apart from Norway.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I think we have some affirmative due diligence requirements. I think one thing to note about the way they set up those prohibitions is they did use the word knowingly, right? And so it's importing, a prohibition on importing VCS hardware that we know to have originated with or been designed, developed, manufactured, supplied by a covered person. And so, there is a little bit of give there, but certainly that doesn't, it's not a stick your head in the sand kind of thing, right? That certainly doesn't relieve us of that due diligence obligation. And to do that due diligence up and down the supply chain, which is, something that I think we've seen, the due diligence obligation, I think we've seen in a number of different regulatory regimes at this point. And so it's not really a new thing for us, but certainly something that is an everyday battle because it's so extensive, right? There's a lot to it.
Yeah, I mean, so one area where we've had experience in this in terms of kind of past changes to regimes and this kind of sort of what is knowingly from a due diligence standpoint was when Commerce changed the rules with respect to Chinese military end users back in 2020. And essentially, I think it's 744.21 prevents a U.S. company from exporting certain things to China, knowing that they would go to a Chinese military end user. But the definition of Chinese military end user was very broad, and you had to figure out, am I dealing with a Chinese military end user? It includes things like potential universities and that sort of thing. And the statute required knowingly. And so essentially you would do your due diligence and try and figure out, like, who is the end user of this? Is it a university? Is it a university that has a military testing lab? Because that might fall within the definition of Chinese end users. At some point, Commerce put in guidance to try and help you do that. It unfortunately wasn't exclusive guidance. They gave us a list, but it wasn't an exhaustive list. And they had some guidance in terms of what factors to look for, but they still weren't conclusive on that. I mean, have we had any experience yet with guidance on kind of what sort of due diligence will get you past a knowingly because the term knowingly includes the idea that you know, but then should you have known, and so did you do enough work that this was something that if you missed it, it was something that nobody would have found, or at least nobody reasonably would have found.
Yeah, not that I've seen so far. It's possible there's something out there, but it's I think one thing we can expect, and this is something that the ICTS team has promised, is more guidance going forward. Like as all this stuff, it's still sort of getting up and into place. I mean, I think passing March 16th was a big hurdle just to see if there were going to be any changes to the rule from the Trump administration, and it turned out no. And so now I think Commerce is really turning their attention to developing kind of their sort of book of guidance and compliance tools that they're going to offer to industry. So I mean, really looking forward to whatever guidance they put out on that. I think we can, as you say, there are plenty of examples out there, whether it's within Commerce's regs or within Treasury's regulations on sanctions, that lay out kind of what our obligations are when it comes to due diligence. That I think that'll be helpful and instructive. But hopefully we'll see something from Commerce as well.
Great. Well, I know that we've talked a little bit about the bipartisan nature of this effort, and it has kind of gone from Trump 1 through Biden, and it sounds like it's surviving through Trump 2 and maybe even being expanded. Today, and I guess it's April 10th when we're recording this, it looks like Senator Slotkin from Michigan, where you are, Matt, has introduced legislation to codify and maybe expand some of the automated vehicle protections.
Yeah, breaking news. Yeah, I haven't seen a public version of the text yet. I think it will be interesting to see what that legislation includes and how much support it gets. Senator Slotkin, I believe, introduced a similar bill last year when she was a member of the House, and haven't had a chance yet to compare this new legislation with what she introduced last year. I think the hope would be that any legislation kind of maintains the flexibility that Commerce has, because we are in a national security space, we're in a technology space, and so I think important for the regulations and for Commerce to be able to stay nimble, and as tech evolves, as their experience with this rule, quite frankly, evolves, to be able to calibrate how they're implementing it. But yeah, I think it's a good example of the ways in which there continues to be really, really strong interest in this. I think on both sides of the aisle, both from the Trump administration by Republicans and Democrats in Congress. I think it's going to continue to be. I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation, and honestly wouldn't be shocked if we do see some calibrations to the connected vehicles in the rule in the future, to see it either become a little bit more strict, or have some allowances in certain around the edges, or just calibrated to kind of more it's very well targeted, I think, at what Commerce has expressed as the national security concern. But I think it'd be interesting to see how it evolves over the years, especially as we get into these future model years when the prohibitions will really take hold.
Words to live by. Caroline, I know you've been following this very closely as well. Any parting thoughts in terms of what's to come, or anything kind of happening recently that you wanted to stake out?
I'm actually just very curious how these regs will play out, given Trump's suggestion in his America First executive order to review where these rules could be further strengthened. What does that mean for the future? We know what the regs say right now. Are they looking at ways to expand these to other areas of the vehicles and technologies, or other kinds of vehicles that aren't currently covered? For example, what we've discussed now covers like passenger vehicles that are on public highways, right? Which I understand includes cars and motorcycles. But it doesn't cover bigger machinery that isn't used on public highways. So is that something that Trump wants to expand this to? Or, where does this go from here if he's really interested in expanding these? And Matt, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one good bellwether for that will be, Commerce noted that they sort of carved commercial vehicles out of this particular rule. As you say, it's more focused on passenger vehicles and light duty trucks and the kind of stuff that you or I would drive on the road. But they did promise to do something on commercial vehicles at some point in the future, and so I think I've heard rumors that they might be in the process of starting to look at that commercial vehicles rule, and so I think it will be really interesting to see, what comes out on commercial vehicles, how quickly it moves, whether it aligns with the timeline that they've laid out here for passenger vehicles, and whether it's broader than what Commerce kind of originally had suggested they might do. So it'll be really interesting to see and watch.
That I think that's kind of the words to live by for this, is that this is really interesting. It's actually going to be very important. I'm not sure how many people know that it's there, but we should try and check in 6 months from now to see where it's gone, because I think that a lot could change between now and then, but also there could be a lot of movement towards implementation, because I think we're getting pretty close even now, but 6 months from now we will be right on the cusp.
6 months will be years from now.
Exactly. Well, Matt, Caroline, thanks a lot for a great discussion on ICTS, and I think we'll leave it with that.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Produced by Heartcast Media.